Great companies connect talent to bringing value to their client, and they align that. But if the compensation plan doesn't align talent with value creation, then you're not an efficient, effective organization. You're not getting the most out of what you could. And that's what Tom is going to educate us on. So Tom is a thought leader under talent relative to compensation. Next slide, please. Tom and I, we've known each other a little over a year now. And Tom has been doing what he does in the area of compensation for many years. They've been at 15 years at VisionLink Advisors, if I have that correct, Tom, perhaps longer. And Tom also is currently working with one of my clients, so I speak as a fellow coach, someone who's partnered with Tom in an active client. Tom, let me stop speaking now and turn it over to you for our conversation today.
Thank you, Keith. Appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to be with your leadership team, your coaches today. So let me give very brief background, and then let me try and share some very practical ideas that might come up as you talk with your clients about this important and really crucial topic of compensation. It's never been more important than it is today in this competitive landscape for attracting and retaining premier talent. So yeah, quick snapshot. It's actually 25 years, Keith. It feels like maybe 10 in the last year. So I'll go with the 15 if you want. But yeah, we were founded in 1996. We're a kind of a boutique compensation practice, but we have clients all around the country. We have clients, I think, in almost every state in Canada and even a few overseas. My consulting team's backgrounds include compensation, benefits, finance, law, executive benefits, and we've built hundreds of what we call value sharing plans, commonly called incentive plans or bonus plans or similar, phantom stock. This is incentive plans, or what we call value sharing, is a highly specialized focus for us. And we look at compensation in kind of a holistic context. So in other words, if a client comes to us and says, hey, Tom, I know my bonus plan is bad. We got to fix it. Help us do that. We can certainly help with that, but we take a step back and ask, what's your total rewards strategy? How are you lining up your total rewards investment to help drive your long-term enterprise growth initiatives? We're also very good at using technology to accommodate clients all around the country, of course. Probably like most of you, we do most of our meetings through Zoom-like meetings and transactions. But we also have our own software for building and operating plans. Actually, it's software we turn the keys to the client, so the client can manage their compensation programs internally. So they're in control, they can stay in the driver's seat. We won't look at that today, but maybe in a future time we can show you what that looks like. So that's just a little bit about us. Why don't we talk about how to build great compensation programs? So let's start with what I call the basic axiom of compensation. If you design, operate, and communicate compensation well, you're going to get better performance. Everybody accepts that intuitively, but almost all companies struggle with it. Note there's three pieces: design, operate, and communicate. And maybe you design well, but you operate poorly or communicate poorly. I have a slide I didn't throw in today's deck, but it shows how much money large public companies spend on just communicating their compensation program to their employees. It's in the millions. But smaller private companies don't communicate it well. Even if they come up with a great compensation idea, after time, the employees forget about it, they don't understand it, or they don't value or appreciate it, so it's dollars wasted. But if you can do all three of these things well, you get better performance in the organization. To do so, let's set up a couple of rules. First rule is, when your client says, I need to get market data so I can match our pay with the market, that's a bit of a red flag, at least an orange flag. Yeah, you want to know what the market data is, or are, I guess, but you need to be sure you don't just try and match what your competitors or your peers are doing. You need to look at your organization's unique structure, characteristic, culture, goals, and business model when designing your unique compensation program. Secondly, clients should be open to new ways of thinking about pay. It's probably like with you sometimes. It's interesting when a client hires a consultant and then tells the consultant what they want them to do, as opposed to what outcomes are you looking for? Well, we're kind of like you. When I'm designing a compensation plan for a client, I want to know what their real outcomes are. What are your desired outcomes, and at two different levels? Because then I can maybe pull in a compensation tool that you would never have imagined in order to help you build a great comp strategy. The most common outcomes clients say they want when we first talk to them are shown here. But I break them down into two primary areas: performance and talent. And Keith was talking about talent at the beginning here. Absolutely true. We're still in a very competitive market environment. We surveyed all our clients last year during the height of the pandemic impact on the economy. Very few had laid off key talent because they knew it'd be hard to get them back or to find equivalent talent. And so we find that employers generally, when I ask, what percentile of top percentile of talent are you looking for in your organization? The average is going to be about 20%. I want the top 20%, top quintile. To do that, you have to think creatively about compensation. Secondly, performance. Do your compensation plans drive performance? Are they focusing people on the right outcomes? And are they encouraging accountability and destroying entitlement? The higher level of outcomes are stated like this. We want to transform our employees into growth partners. We want to build a unified financial vision for growing the business. Unifying, in this case, of course, the shareholders and the employees. We want to share value, but with those who create value. This goes to mindset. And mindset comes first. It comes before behavior, right? If you change mindset of your employees, you begin to change behavior. And meaningful change in performance only follows a change in mindset. So often I ask a new prospect, what are you hoping your annual incentive plan to do? They commonly say, I want to see a change in behavior. And then I say, okay, well, let's start with mindset then. Do they consider themselves growth partners in your business? You've got to get to that mindset first. Now, compensation, of course, can't do that alone. You all know that. But if you don't align compensation with the expectations of business performance, you won't create a growth mindset. Okay, so proof of concept. So first of all, we've been doing this a long time. We've worked with a lot of companies and have seen things that work and things that don't work. But we can also look at the public marketplace where the data are more readily available. Both, how do they pay their leadership team and what kind of performance do they get? And there's a lot of studies out there that try and demonstrate the kind of pay that will drive performance. And this is what we see as our basic conclusions about the mistakes in private companies. Private companies underutilize variable pay or at-risk pay. I'll show you some data on that in just a minute. When they do use variable pay, which they'll do, they improperly balance it. It's too short term. The incentive strategies they use generally don't work. There's either too much entitlement or they're too complicated and people just kind of forget about them. They offer weak long-term retirement support. So there's been a movement in the market away from retirement plans, and probably justifiably, that tends to be the culture right now, but private companies ignore it almost completely, other than perhaps a modest match to the 401k. And the emphasis is all on at-risk pay. Public companies have not done that. Last thing is there are major gaps in their benefits programs. The executive leadership team members who are more highly paid have caps and limits on some of their benefit programs that go unnoticed or unrecognized. And they're easy to close those gaps, and public companies close those gaps. And so these are things that private companies can analyze and fix. Some of these are super easy fixes. Others take some real thought and commitment to rebalance and reorganize their pay allocation. And let's talk pay allocation, because this is an interesting topic that it's a very stimulating topic once a CEO gets it. He goes, I see what you're saying here. Yeah, this is intriguing. Well, what are we talking about? Well, let's think about these 4 quadrants of pay. And imagine you had an executive and your total commitment was going to be $300,000 for everything for this significant recruit. Well, how would you spread that $300,000 out into these 4 boxes? They do it without thinking about it. So they say, we'll make your salary $200,000 and you have a benefits package that's worth $25,000. So right away, $225,000 is in the upper left box, short-term fixed. Oh, and we have a match on the 401k. So if you put in $15,000, you're going to get $5,000 there. So $5,000 goes in long-term fixed. What about short-term variable? Well, that would be the annual bonus. So maybe you say you have a bonus opportunity of $30,000. That would go in the short-term variable. And then what's left might go in a long-term variable, some type of share equivalent plan or phantom stock plan or something like that. So if you do that now, you could compute the percentages that's in each box, right? So the question becomes, what percentage of a total pay budget should be allocated to each box? Well, the answer to that depends on several things. What's the expectation of the employee? And what's our business model and business pay philosophy? So what happens is, in the public companies, these are small cap companies, they put 70% of their senior executive pay at risk. And of the amount that's at risk, 72% of that is long-term. It's almost the opposite in private companies. They put well over 70% in fixed, usually closer to 80%. And they do sometimes 90% short-term versus 72% or more in a public company. So here's a pay allocation that's just dropped in as a sample. You usually can't get a private company to go that far to the at-risk side because they don't have stock or stock options to share. But you still need to think about populating each box. If you're not populating each box in a meaningful way, you're not addressing the needs of your employees. And here's what we see. This is an actual client before we started working with them. This was their top, I think, about 8 people, and a $2.6 million budget. Very typical. This is not selected just as an outlier. This is very common. 94% short-term, 81% fixed. And so this is saying you're not going to get the kind of long-term performance you want because you're not creating a long-term opportunity for wealth creation for your leadership team. They're also a little settled because so much is fixed, so much is guaranteed. These are the leaders of the organization. Do your owners have fixed pay? No. All of their remuneration is variable. It's at risk. Why shouldn't your leadership team's pay be more at risk? That's what this discussion is all about in building a coherent, competitive, intriguing, and attractive pay strategy. Top talent will find this discussion really intriguing.
Tom, may I insert a question real quick?
Sure.
So there's quite a difference between a public company and the private company data.
Yep.
And why is that? How much of that is the liquidity of stock in a public company versus the lack of knowledge, experience, data in the private company on how to strategically build a compensation program, or is there another major factor?
Yeah, I think you hit on the main factors. First of all, they don't have the means of just issuing, shareholder approved options and RSUs fairly freely, but within limits. And secondly, they traditionally have just not thought about compensation in this fashion. Most private companies are going through the early stages that all public companies once went through, right? Which is, we have limited capital, limited resources. How do we pay our people effectively? And so you say, well, let's start with a salary. And then we add a modest group medical plan. And then we kind of ease in some kind of bonus plan. And so those three pieces become the core. And you can see here, that's what this company had. We're at what, 72% salary, 18% short-term incentives, 4% benefits, 4% retirement. So very typical. They haven't evolved to the point that they've thought about this. Public companies are going to engage comp consultants who are going to advise them on this kind of theory and practice better.
And so, Tom, the net result of this is my discernment, correct or modify this. A privately held company may be using excess capital for fixed compensation without a long-term incentive to get them where they want to be through the leadership team.
That's usually the glaringly missing piece, is a long-term incentive program.
Okay, thank
Some
you.
of the other things can usually be tweaked or enhanced or embellished. The long-term piece is almost always missing. Often that's how they find us, because they go, we know we need something. We don't know what it is, but we know there's a gap. And so that's a big piece. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec.
Okay, thank you. And coaches, feel free to reach out on chat if you have questions. I can pepper those in with Tom. Keep going, Tom.
Okay. So here's one way of thinking about this that might be helpful. If you look at the labels of these three boxes on the left, aggressive growth, steady growth, stable performance, these are overly simplistic labels for certain types of companies out there in the market, right? Aggressive growth means we're going to have a hockey stick here going. We're going to grow significantly and fast and have a risk-willing leadership. The steady growth, I would call this generalizing. We have strong growth expectations, 10% a year, 5 to 15% a year. That's good growth. A professional management team and a long-term horizon, or maybe they're what we call a stable performance company. They've got a nice big market share. They're protecting great cash flow and profitability. They're a little bit more of a preservation mindset than dramatic growth mindset. And we could fill in other models here, right? But this is just to point out how you would shift the compensation depending upon the nature of the business goals and the kind of talent that they need to adopt. So at the top, we're going to have maybe 60% of the pay is short term, unlike that small cap company where it was 30 to 40% short term. But we're going to add a significant variable long-term piece here at 35% of the total pay package. As we go down, that long-term variable is 18% or maybe even only 10%. So settling in on this tactic or this strategy is an important thing to do. This is a reflection of the elements of pay, the cupboard of items to be selected from to build a pay strategy. And this is a reflection of the things that the employee has in his or her mind that he's hoping the compensation package can provide. Assured income, performance upside, long-term wealth, family protection, and secure retirement. And depending upon the employee, they might balance their pie completely different from another. If somebody's, age 55, going to retire in 10 years, let's say, well, that retirement issue jumps out to them. But if they're 25 or 35, that may be virtually insignificant. So you have to build a balanced strategy that can be applied systematically and potentially even very flexibly in the organization. So you got to take these pieces on the left in the blue pie and help kind of merge into the orange pie and satisfy the expectations of the employees while trying to drive performance. Each element on the left touches on some element on the right. Let's take long-term incentives and equity. What do they satisfy? Well, there's two things here: long-term wealth opportunities as well as performance upside. So we'll look at this next graphic, but I'm just going to click through it quickly. This is kind of the process that a business can follow to build a great and well integrated and coordinated pay strategy. A compensation philosophy statement, a pay structure that organizes pay by grades and positions, then short-term value sharing, like an annual incentive plan, long-term value sharing, phantom stock or something like that. Integrate the benefits plan so it doesn't just run away from a cost perspective and get out of control. Fill gaps with executive benefits, have a great communication process and a strong operational system so that you're not reinventing the compensation program every other year. Let's dive a little more, unless there's any questions here, into the red and the blue pieces over here.
There is one question from Coach Xavier in the Northeast. How strong is the correlation between high long-term variable compensation and actual business performance? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I could try and dig up some statistics in some studies. I don't have them handy, but ultimately it's highly demonstrable that there is a correlation between strong long-term wealth opportunities and long-term performance. Otherwise, companies wouldn't keep doing it, right? You know, it varies, it's all over the board. It's no guarantee of strong performance. If you build a long-term plan poorly, you can get adverse results, the unexpected results. You have to be very thoughtful. We see a lot of long-term plans that aren't constructed well. I'll give a quick example. If you put in a long-term pay strategy, let me just say a stock appreciation rights plan where an employee gets some awards, which can then grow in value, and you only get the increase as the value of the company grows. We see most companies tend to award a whole bunch to employees up front and then forget about it. It's much better to parse those out over time. So if you were going to give me 10,000 SARs, I might want them right up front, but you'll get better results if you give me 2,000 a year for 5 years, or maybe 1,500 a year forever, every year. And they all have different maturity dates and vesting schedules, so that you keep me reaching out there for that carrot and helping and raising the bar and striving for greater and greater performance. So I would say this, Xavier, a bad long-term plan doesn't help, but a well-designed plan following proper principles definitely demonstrates improvement.
Thank you, Tom.
So let's look a little closer at this idea of value sharing. So here's your present company, and you're paying people salaries, stip, and benefits, short-term incentive plan and benefits. We say, tell us about your future company. Where are you going to be in 5 years or 10 years? What's your horizon? And one piece that's going to be missing then is we got to have a long-term plan. You have to be willing to share some of that growth with your team, or you will minimize the amount of growth that you will actually produce. Going to kind of Xavier's question, this is a crucial element to recruit premier talent. They're not going to come on board. A lot of engagements we enter into start like this. Yeah, phone call, Tom, I'm hiring this guy. He's a potential future CEO for us. And he wants equity in the business to come on board. What do I do? Say, well, let's work something out. That's a good thing. He wants to help you grow the business. He wants to stay around and realize value. And let's share some of the value. And with him, if he's going to be a rainmaker, your piece of the pie will get bigger. So this long-term piece is essential to attract and retain premier talent. Speaking of retain, it's the key element in retention, because you're always going to have something they forfeit if they leave before you want them to. So short-term value sharing plan. These plans, interestingly, they're ubiquitous. Everybody's got some kind of bonus plan. In 2016, World at Work, a huge global HR compensation an organization, did a survey of private company CEOs. There were thousands of responders. And one of the questions was, do you have an annual incentive plan? 86% answered yes. I'm sure some of the little tiny ones didn't have one. Then they asked the question, is your plan effective? Guess how many said yes, it's effective? 10%. So 86% of these companies were spending probably in aggregate billions of dollars on bonus plans, but only 10% said they were effective. Why? Well, this is what I call the STIP, the short-term incentive plan spectrum. And this is the challenge, is landing in the sweet spot on the spectrum. Most plans either produce too much entitlement. Might call that a profit sharing pool. Oh, you're going to get 0.72% of the profits. Okay, great. And so at the end of the year, you get a check for $6,200. And now what have we done? We just set an expectation. It's a loose connection to employer goals. You shouldn't really expect any behavioral change for me. There's low line of sight, very simplistic. And next year, what if profits are down and I only get $3,200 instead of $6,200? I'm like, well, wait a minute, what's going on? I worked harder this year than last year, and I'm smarter and I'm better. So we have this problem with a pure profit sharing model in most cases. What's on the other end of the spectrum? A heavy KPI plan. This is where the CEO, the CFO, the HR leader, and perhaps others all sit down in a conference room and they thrash out a plan that's going to have 6, 7, 8 moving pieces to it. And they're going to roll it out and it's going to look kind of complicated. And the employees are going to go, how do I work this plan to get my maximum bonus? And they're going to find little tricks they can make. They're going to find ways to sandbag. There's going to be, or they might just ignore it and say, I don't know, it's too complicated. Let's just see what happens. You have to land in the middle here and create a partnership with the employees. You want to fund the plan primarily from profits, but you've got to destroy entitlement. So you have to teach employees about ownership return. Why do the shareholders get a return before we get payments? You have to have minimum performance standards here. There's a lot that can go into this, but you've got to keep it simple, but not simplistic. And you'd have to construct it wisely, but not over-engineer it. And we could have a whole 2-hour meeting on how to do all that, but there are ways to do it. And threading this needle does take some serious effort and commitment. That's what we call a value sharing plan. It's funded by company profits, but it's not an entitlement. So building a short-term value sharing plan, you get the objectives right, identify your participants, create a budget. Now you begin to assign opportunities to employees, what they might earn. Pick the right metrics, but don't go overboard. Allocate the plan. Sometimes it's just company performance. In our company, it's just company performance, even though we have 3 distinct departments. But some companies want to use certain business units or departments. How will employee performance influence the bonus? You address that. Study the numbers, confirm it, and launch it and communicate it. Any questions anybody has on kind of short-term value sharing plans and how to do it right? And then we'll look at long-term.
Tom, one question is, what's the dividing line between short-term and long-term? Maybe talk about that a little bit.
Okay, so short-term is basically any plan that's going to pay out in a year or less. So commonly they're going to be annual or quarterly. Annual being, in the world of leadership, the dominant payment mode. Quarterly, maybe for lower employees in the organization. long-term picks up at 3 years. You don't see too many 2-year plans out there. So long-term plans are 3, 4, 5 years or longer. They could run all the way out 10, 20 years to retirement. So long-term really means if you're going to give me a piece of paper today, and that piece of paper is hopefully going to be worth something out in the future. And defining that future, and sometimes there's multiple payment possibilities, that's a long-term plan, 3+ years.
Okay. And then Coach Rick in Alberta, regarding the growth curve of a company, is there a certain tipping point or a point in growth, revenue or growth rate, where the alignment of comp structure is critical for future growth and strategy?
I guess it'd be easy to say that's at all levels, right? You always want to reevaluate, but you do if your business model or your business prospects change. So let's just thinking of an example. We have a client working with right now where they are expecting very dramatic growth for the next 2 or 3 years because of their industry and their opportunity. But then they expect, because of the market share they'll achieve at that point, then they'll have more modest growth after that. So you might use one type of long-term plan for the first few years, and then they might shift their gears to a different type of long-term plan after that. So flexibility in the implementation on a year-to-year basis is part of the management system for the program.
Okay. Thank you, Tom.
Okay. So just a few more slides here. Let's see. Long-term plan. Well, we've hit this pretty hard, haven't we? This is the plan that does the best alignment of long-term objectives of shareholders and employees. You typically want to tie it for the leadership team to enterprise value growth. So you have to find a way to establish that benchmark. You don't need to go get a formal appraisal of the business. There are plenty of indicators in a company to reflect core underlying value. And then you anticipate what kind of growth there may be to the organization. You carve out some of that budget and you say, we're allocating some of this to you, Keith. This is what it looks like today. And here's what that opportunity might be in the future. In the recruiting interview for top talent, this should be the plan that really stands out. This should be the plan that makes them say, wow, this is a differentiator. It sends a deep message to your team about your commitment to them, because it's a bit of an unknown, isn't it? You don't really know what it's going to turn out to be. We model it under various growth scenarios so the client is comfortable with low growth, moderate growth, or heavy growth. But it's still, you're committing to something now and you don't know exactly what it's going to cost you in the future. So that's a leap of faith or a step of faith forward that you need to find a way to reassure the client is appropriate to take. Building out the plan looks a little bit like the short-term plan, similar steps, objectives. There's 9 different types of long-term value sharing plans. So you got to find the right type or types. You got to budget for it, select your participants. The short-term plan may have everybody in the company. The long-term plan is usually more restricted. Work out all the, crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's, a lot of details to work out because we need a formal legal document for a long-term plan. Many of these plans get funded because the client doesn't want this naked liability on the balance sheet. They want a funding plan to cover that with an asset. Get all the documents pulled together. We produce what we call the legal ready documents, all ready for client counsel to review. And then you need an enduring plan to operate your new program. And then you're ready to launch the plan to your team. So I've got just really one more slide and then we can circle back and answer any questions here. If in terms of identifying, well, how do you describe VisionLink to a client? What do they do? Here's kind of just some basic talking points. So VisionLink is a compensation design firm. We focus on that term design. If you think of a designer, a designer has to get inside your head, extract ideas and the vision of what you really want to accomplish, and then present ideas to you and then help you complete that. And that's what we do. We help you align your pay programs with your business strategy and goals. We serve primarily privately owned growth companies of all sizes. And here's how we help the CEO. We help you position an attractive pay offering so that you can win the talent wars, attract and retain premier talent, and then focus your team on the most important elements of business performance, on execution. And it's fair to say that we are incentive plan specialists. 80+% of our engagements revolve around building out either a short-term or a long-term value sharing program. And when we do that, we focus on every idea that comes up. We ask, is that going to eliminate entitlement or promote entitlement? Which way is it going to push? And is it going to send the right message to your employees about how their contribution to growth will be rewarded? And then the best way to introduce us is basically tell the client you can arrange a complimentary introductory phone call, and we get acquainted and learn from one another whether we can help.
Tom, let's have you click back one slide, and there's some questions coming in. So let's talk about the process. So let's say a coach has a client they're working with, they're a growth client, and they want to bring differentiated value to the coach's client. And this can be in the area of talent, one of the 7 attributes, and specifically the compensation plans to help the CEO, their client, attract the right talent, retain the right talent. But also the third thing, which often isn't really conscious, is align value creation, the team, the compensation plan to the client. So here you have the building process on this slide. What does that engagement look like from you have your first call with the client? How long does this take for a middle market growth privately held company? And then typically what would the cost range be for something like this?
Okay, so I'm going to scroll back up to this kind of master slide of the process. Here's how our overall process usually works. I mentioned the first initial phone call. So we have a phone call, and at the end of that call, hopefully the client says, we're curious, sounds like you might be able to help us, what's next? The next meeting is a presentation like this. In fact, some of these actual slides are used in that. What I want to do in that meeting is listen to make sure we understand their objectives and demonstrate our credibility and capabilities, and zero in by the end of that call on where to begin. That's the toughest part, because you can join this wheel at any point. Now, you could start at the top and say, we better identify our compensation philosophy, and so that we can understand better what type of programs should be used. Or they might say, this is all good, Tom, but I know what we need. I'm pretty confident we need a new short-term value sharing plan, so we can enter in the red box and start there. So we have to identify whether they are looking for a project that is going to be all-encompassing and potentially over time incorporate everything, or zero in on 1 or 2 elements. Does that part of the answer make sense?
It does.
Okay. Once we do that, then we can say, okay, to do that, we can give you a price. Most of our projects range between $10,000 and $25,000. Most closer to the 20 range if we're building out a value sharing plan. A very simple engagement, a simple short-term bonus plan maybe is in the $10,000 range. So most are in that $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, $25,000 range. Those are customary projects for us. And the length of a common project is 8 to 12 weeks.
Coach Michael Sink in Memphis asked a question. When you build out the short-term and a long-term plan, do you typically see the leadership team having sacrificing more of the short-term for the long-term plan incentives as these are built?
Sometimes, yes. So remember this slide I showed you about the balance between short-term and long-term. You'll see on this one, the short-term plan is 15% of the total, and the long-term plan is 35% of the total. What we don't want to see is the opposite in most cases. But now what happens is when we start, we're not starting in a vacuum, right? Where we're picking employees off a planet and putting them into the companies fresh and have a clean slate to design the compensation program. We have to start with where we are now. So if you have an employee, let's say their salary is 150 and their bonus is 50. Okay. Now we're introducing a long-term plan. If we went something like what we're seeing here, the long-term plan would have to have a current present value of $100,000. That might be a little rich. So unless we're able to trim the short-term plan down to 25. So that's an important discussion to have with the decision makers at the company. Are we trimming the short-term plan or simply adding to it? If you trim it, you usually build a transition period, 2 or 3 years, because the long-term plan is not going to kick in until some point down the road. That make sense? So yes, you got to address this, but it is not uncommon, Michael, to trim the short-term plan, at least over time, as you phase in the long-term plan.
What would be an example of compensation philosophy? That's the first on the 1 o'clock position, 12 or 1 o'clock position on your wheel. What is involved in philosophy and what might that look like, an example or two?
So a compensation philosophy can sometimes be captured, and a lot of our clients do, in a literal philosophy statement. Picture a 1.5 page statement. And it essentially says, this is why we pay compensation, and this is how we pay compensation. So the whys will say things like, we want to provide a meaningful lifestyle for our employees. We want a fair and competitive compensation program that helps them address some of those 5 orange needs. They may be identified in the compensation philosophy statement. The how is then, we will utilize the following elements of compensation to fairly reward our employees. We will use salaries. You might say we will try to benchmark our salaries at the 50th percentile in the marketplace, or you may not state that. So it's whatever you want to say that identifies what tools you use, why you use them, who participates, and how you will communicate them. The comp philosophy statement can be handed to an employee or a potential employee in the hiring interview. Hey, before showing you your pay offer, I want you to read our comp philosophy statement to see if we agree philosophically on how we should orient our pay. This then precludes or inhibits the likelihood that 9 months later, they're going to be back in your office complaining about pay. Or if they do, you can say, well, didn't you read our pay philosophy statement? That's how we deal with this. So I kind of call it the Declaration of Independence about our pay. It's our principles and practices of pay. The pay grade structure is the Constitution. This is what we actually do to manage pay. The pay philosophy is our comp theory about how we treat employees fairly and reward for value creation.
Tom, a couple more questions. Coach Jerome up in Vancouver, British Columbia, asking about how do you mitigate against someone who's in the long-term plan, but they're underperforming, but stay on the bus for the long-term payout?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting question, Jerome. You don't want employees hanging around because of the pay, right? You don't want them leaving because of the pay, but you also don't want them lingering when they're underperforming. I'm going to refer back to something I mentioned 20 minutes ago about the problem with long-term plans. So if you produce a long-term plan for me that has one big block of grants that are going to mature and pay out in 8 or 9 or 10 years, and it's going to be a big number. I'm going to do everything I can to hang in there to get that payment. But if you're awarding grants every year, that could turn into the same value, but you're controlling those grants. So now the number of grants I get every year is not guaranteed. If I stop to perform, or I'm not performing as well, I'm going to get fewer or possibly no grants. So the pot at the end of the rainbow is not going to have as much gold in it. So you can mitigate against lingering poor or mediocre performance by controlling the grants over time and recognizing, acknowledge to the employees that, hey, you got to perform well to earn grants. Otherwise, this plan won't have that much meaning to you. That's one approach. There's some other ideas there too, but that's the key thing we do to address that issue.
Okay. Tom, two more questions. These will come from me as a coach. Okay. Well, as a coach and the leader of Gravitas, when you are engaged and dig in, how often do you find leaky buckets or misstructured comp programs, incentives that you can actually save the company money by identifying and thus offset the cost of your engagement or even multiply the value of the investment in your engagement?
That's a great question, which I'm not sure we have identified a concrete way of pointing directly to a dollar value that was just saved. Most of the ideas we present are intended, or many are intended, to plug those leaks and weld over them so they don't reoccur. And we count on the client to recognize that error and attribute and kind of spend that money somewhere else, whether it's covering our fees or basically producing a better ROI for the employer. So probably not a lot of direct conversions there to that issue, but a lot of indirect discussion around that concept.
Okay. So what comes to mind for me is based on what you shared, public company have greater long-term weight on their incentive plans. Private companies put a lot more cash out up front in the near term. And so is it true that as you work with a privately held company, when you rebalance short-term and long-term, you actually are freeing up short-term capital to accelerate the growth of the company by implementing some long-term incentive plans?
That can definitely be the case in the right situation. The thing with this fixed variable concept is the more pay that is at risk and you have employees willing to assume that risk, there are two things implicit there. One, if we have great performance, you're going to make more money here than you're going to make somewhere else. So if you want to come on board because you think you can make a difference, you can help us grow, then you'll make more money here. You may not have the same guarantees. So if you want to find somebody that's going to pay you another $40,000 in salary, you may find that. But here, you might get that $40,000 of lost salary, if you want to think of it that way, may translate to $400,000 of improved value at some point in time. So you appeal to an entrepreneurial mindset if that's the goal of the recruitment effort. The other thing it does is that if you have a downturn, so another pandemic hits and your business is affected, your payroll costs are automatically lower because your fixed commitment is more manageable. And you're able to tell the employees, like many of our clients did last year this time, or around this time when everything started hitting the fan, hey, the expectation of bonuses this year should probably be quite low, but that's okay. Because of the way we are structured, we're going to do fine. You're going to get your salary and benefits, and we'll bounce back. It's a good time to set up a long-term plan to compensate people for kind of the lost earnings from last year into future earnings for recovering that growth.
Okay. Tom, let's end with this. I always like to arm our community with 2 or 3 questions as they talk with their clients. And so here's what's coming to mind. So coach me on this, and the coaches listening in can write these down or modify them. So if I want to open a conversation with one of my clients, I might start with, do you have a written compensation philosophy statement? And can we look at that and talk about that together, coach and client? Is that a fair question, Tom?
Absolutely. Yeah. Even simplifying it, what is your compensation philosophy? Yeah, I don't know. I guess they'll kind of shorthand one. Then you say, have you tried to put that in writing? Do you have a written statement? Because you'll find very few have any kind of written statement out there. But yeah,
Okay.
Starting point.
Okay. Another one could be, do you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the value creation for your client is aligned with the attraction, the retention, and the value creation by your talent in the company?
Yeah. I might say that as, what have you done to align shareholder value creation with the performance expectations of your employees and how they're paid? Do they get paid for the same results as the shareholders earn value? Somewhere in there, that kind of question is a very conversation stimulating discussion.
Okay. And then the last one might be something around, hey, we Gravitas are aligned with a partner called VisionLink Advisors. What they found is most privately held companies have an imbalance of short-term versus long-term comp, assuming they want long-term growth of the business with their talent. Do you know your ratio of long-term and short-term, and is that something you would like to look into with a professional? Now, I've made that complex, but reflect on where I was going with that, Tom, what you're hearing.
Yeah, very appropriate. Information in studies indicate that if you want long-term sustainable, profitable growth over time, a heavy portion of your compensation allocation needs to reward employees for that long-term growth, referred to as long-term incentive plans. Tell me what kind of long-term incentive plan you have, and is it the dominant part of the compensation package for your employee team, for your employees?
Okay, great. Okay, hey, coaches, thanks for the great questions. Tom, thanks for your time today. We appreciate you as a thought leader within Gravitas and the talent attribute. What can coaches be doing to help you in what you're doing with VisionLink Advisors?
Well, we love hearing input from coaches and others that work with clients about the compensation issues they're dealing with, the real world compensation headaches that are on the table in the companies you're representing, because together maybe we can find solutions that will help them. So we always look forward to engaging in any kind of conversation along those lines.
Okay. Tom, thank you so much. Appreciate your time very much. Coaches, thanks for tuning in today.
Thank you all. Have a great day.